So how much time? I have 10 minutes? 10. I'm before lunch, so usually the guy, out of courtesy of the host, makes it short so people will get enough time for lunch. So restricting CO pay backfires, evidence from China. So I think the question is clear. Should CO pay be restricted? It's very topical. I think we agree it's important. It seems to be highly debated now, as I said, also in Israel, and it's interesting. And there are different views. Some say that it should be restricted because it really is too high, and Bebchuk, I understand, is the proponent of that. And then there's others, including Jensen, I understand, that think that suggest that it shouldn't be restricted because it creates just a lot of noise. We don't know whether it's beneficial. It's probably not. As the more frictions you add, the more chaos you usually create. So what do I have to say in this paper? Well, the story here is that there was new legislation in China in 2009. The regulation limit executive salaries for centrally administrated state-owned enterprises. There was no such restriction on the local state-owned enterprises and not on the private enterprises. And using a math sample analysis between CSOE and those other non-restricted firms, they find that they were adversely affected because it led to more perks, tunneling, and worse performance. Okay, so first let's start with some nice things to say about this paper. It's well written, structured, it's easy to read, the story is clear. You know, the literature is, the literature review places it in the right context, and I actually think that once you start reading it, the first thing you're saying, okay, they're going to do a deed approach, so that's exactly what they did. It's the most natural way to assess the effect of the 2009 regulation. I basically have two major comments. I'm not going to go into other stuff are relatively minor. So first of all, about this new regulation. So the way I see it, I'm not sure where I can place this regulation because we don't know the details. Okay, so on the one hand, you know, we had regulation throughout history, and actually I'm taking the source of Kevin's law in a certain law journal. He has the history of different regulation concerning pay. And there were many, and I'm putting it on between very weak and very strong binding corporate executive pay regulation. So you have say on pay. It's also a certain of a constraint because you have institution needing to vote, and then you had Nixon wage price controls in the 70s, and then you had the stabilization after during World War II, where they froze wages, and here in Israel it's actually a very extreme case where it is binding completely. And I'm not sure that the current regulation that we're studying is really so binding because it doesn't say that it is binding. It's some sort of a proposal that it shouldn't be between 5 and 7.5 points, 5 till 7.5 times the average salary in the firm. So it's not completely clear what exactly that means. So where is it placed? And I think that's an important point because just for expositional purposes, right? How binding it is. I'm not sure that it matters, by the way, if it's completely binding or not. I'm just putting it in the context. I think all of that literature is somewhat related. So that's what I'm writing here. So the guidance are not that clear. Okay, once this exposition is known, the next question, okay, how are we going to infer the effect of this new rule in 2009. So the ideal experiment would be something like this. You have a new rule. Then there is a drop in corporate executive pay for those firms that have this restriction, which are these CSOE firms. And then following that, you have more perks, more tunneling, reduced performance. What is the actual experiment that is done in this paper? Well, you have a new rule, and then you have all of these outcomes. So I think that what is the problem here, of course, is that the causal link from the drop in COP to the other consequences is broken. It's basically you have the event and a lot of outcomes. But what you want to have is you want to have an event, the company reducing the pay because of the event, and then that leads to all of those bad outcomes. And I think, actually, that is the way to go, especially because you have here different types of firms. So I would say, okay, you have the event in 2009. Some firms are going to restrict it, some are not, because it's not 100% binding. Now let's see that those that restricted within those firms versus those other firms which did not restrict have all of these outcomes. Then that would be the more natural matching to do, because these centrally controlled enterprises are not really private firms, and I'm not sure, maybe they're more like the local state-owned companies that have no restriction, but I think this would be the more nice matching to do, because then you can say, well, at least within the context of this rule within China, firms that reduce their pay suffer these consequences because they follow the rules, while those did not follow the rules did not suffer these consequences. Currently, the matching, so that's what I'm writing here. Currently, what is done is that the CSO are matched to LSOE and private firms. When I started reading it, I said, okay, the most natural thing is CSOE to local state ownership, because they're not 100% profit market, profit maximizing, right? Because they have some social goals as well. But after going through the paper, I thought that this would be solved for you a lot of problems, because now you control for exactly the same type of firms within China, and the rule is, and I think that's the natural setup. Other stuff are less important, but I would do propensity score matching, 1-to-1, because some of the stuff there are not 100% clear in terms of how the matching is done. But these are small stuff we can talk about later. So my overall conclusion is, it's important, it's clear, it's an interesting question. I would deal with, say not, this is not 100% binding. In fact, it's probably somewhat binding. That's just important enough. There will be some firms that will oblige by the law, reduce their pay, and they will suffer the bad consequences, and do the matching in that way. That's it.
Thank you, Amir. Questions, of course. We have time. So what I think we'll do, we'll have 10 minutes of questions, and then maybe we'll have 10 minutes of any other questions you have related to any other paper we heard here before.
I guess my question goes to the interpretation. So you end by saying CEOs respond by consuming more perks. And I wonder if that's really the interpretation you have versus firms respond by offering the CEO more perks. Because if it's the CEOs respond by consuming more perks, that sounds like an interesting application of maybe Grossman and more, or Hart and more aggrievement, that they think they deserve more and so they take more. Because otherwise, these CEOs wanted the perks before. Why didn't they take them before? They wanted the loans before. Why didn't they take them before? So I want to know about the interpretation.
So I can't resist. First, why a t-statistic of 3? There's actually some reasonable support for that. First, astronomy uses 3. Physics uses 5. There's a nice paper by Justin McCrary and co-authors that says if you only account for file drawer bias and want to decide whether to believe a result, you should use a t-statistic around 3. That's without taking into account specification search. So that's the defense for 3. For He Hong's paper, suppose I think of excessive executive compensation as tunneling, right, as I do, right? What you've told me is that if I restrict one form of tunneling, we're playing whack-a-mole. The tunneling pops up somewhere else, right? That's not necessarily bad. It depends on whether you get more tunneling somewhere else, the same or less. And so I've got a paper with Lado Atanasov on tunneling in Bulgaria where the old rule was basically the controllers could freeze out the minority for virtually 0 price. Bulgaria put a stop to that. The result was that they took more cash flow tunneling out of the current profits. But that was an awful lot better for investors who still got some of the cash flow, where before that they were getting nothing. So just because there are unintended consequences, it's predictable that if you say, you can't steal this way, I'm going to find a way to steal some other way. That's not necessarily bad. It may be that if you can steal less the other way, that's still better on average. Might be better still if the Chinese government had also stopped managers from taking out loans and not repaying them. But you need to look at the comparable magnitudes of the two.
So I think it would be good to also look at CEO turnover, in the sense that perhaps what happens is that those CEOs, they just don't want to work for those firms anymore because of the cap. And so then they're just going to go to other firms that are not subject to this cap. And then perhaps what happens is that there's a change in the type of CEOs that those firms get. And maybe those CEOs, they're more likely to do tunneling and other things. It would be interesting to look at that as well.
Okay, thanks for the comments. Amir's, the first comment, I'm well aware of that. The Chinese regulation, it's not like an Israeli regulation where you set the cap 35 times. It's rather vague. Actually, we got hold of the confidential documentation, so it's a, you know, they set a cap, but then it also has a function of many other stuff like a firm performance and all. So all we could do is to see whether this regulation is actually binding or not after the 2009 regulation. So we actually saw that the CSOE CEO pay is stabilized and actually didn't increase. So other than that, I'm not sure. I don't think we. Yeah, in fact, although I didn't show what we show, although I didn't show in the presentation, what we show is that those who got more pay cut, they tend to consume more pork and steal more, and their performance drop more. So
I don't think we have that.
Oh, we have that in the paper.
So you use the pay as an instrument? The idea is to use the drop in the pay as the instrument causing all the other...
We didn't really instrument it, but then we just look at the two different groups of the CSOE. So that's... Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah. Using the local SOE as a match, I mean as a control sample, we did that in the robustness test, although we didn't use it in the main analysis. So I mean we used the LSOE as a control sample. All results are more or less the same. So Kevin's point is the POC is a part of compensation. I think that's what he's suggesting. So yes, that's true. I mean the POC and cash compensation could be part of compensation. So the cash pays cost, so naturally POC increases. But as far as the tunneling is concerned, that's not part of compensation. So I think although we use POC as a part of compensation, the result for the tunneling is still holds. So Bernie's question is that the tunneling is not necessarily bad. Yes, again, I mean, one could interpret that the tunneling is also part of compensation. But if that is the case, then we shouldn't see impact on firm performance. So we argue that the incentive changes, so that affects the firm performance. And Javier's, I always get that question whenever I present the turnover. But the thing is, the Chinese, the managerial labor market is not like the U.S. The CSOE, their managers, top managers, they're like politicians. So in fact, we did look at turnover, and there is a little change over this regulation. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. If anybody has in this kind of area another question on restrictions of pay, we talked about a lot today and their effect on performance or on other achievements of the company. Anybody has any other question? I would like to open a debate, perhaps. What's your general opinion about the restrictions of pay and how they affect all this conduct of the CEOs? Okay. If you don't have any question, I have a question for Key, perhaps. Do you think that the tunneling is a reward for good CEOs or not? Perhaps once you have some kind of cap, then the only way to reward a good CEO is to give him a loan. Yes.
I don't know. Probably not. I mean, the extent of tunneling using the corporate loan in China has been really serious. So it 5 to 10% of total asset was this corporate loan. So the Chinese regulator noticed this problem. So to crack down on this issue, so there has been a huge decrease over the last 15 years. But then since 2010, they started increase for CSR. So I'm not sure whether it is a reward, but it could be that the regulator just takes a blind eye to this problem. In that sense, it could be a compensation. I don't know, but yeah, there has been a regulation to reduce this problem.
Kevin, you want to give give us some remarks on these issues? What's, for example, your opinion on putting a cap on the ratio of low and high wage?
Well, I think you probably know what my opinion is on that. I would not let my children eat Ben & Jerry's ice cream for years because they had a 7-to-1 ratio of CEO pay to entry worker pay, and so I had to take a stand and say you got to fight for what you believe on. And it's when they tried to hire a new CEO and they broke that was the first time I let my kids have Ben & Jerry's ice cream.
Okay. Thank you, and I have there another comment, so I'll have it. But you make me hungry with this example. So here's the last question.
So sorry for keeping you off from your lunch. This may be a dumb question at this stage of the presentation, but who sets CEO pay at those enterprises? Is it the CEO? In fact, is it the board? Is it the party? Who responds to the cap by allowing greater theft and so on?
So one of the six departments is called.
This is a law professor.
So as far as the formula is concerned, it's one of the six department. I think is a SASEC. That department directly manages the CSOE.
Who allows for greater theft, greater perks, and so on? That's the question.
Who allows? Well, I guess after all, it's a communist party.
Thank God we don't have a communist party, and we can.